let's not be scared of the change that's coming. Think of these AI systems as like toddlers learning to walk. So they are going to make mistakes. There are things that they're not good at. But can we create a safe playpen for them to operate? Because if they do work, they can help us scale access to care for many, many different scenarios in the next couple of days.
And welcome back, everyone, to the Coachful Coaching Leadership Podcast. This is David Fung. I help leaders get unstuck and get them into the right mindset to be successful. My guest today is Anmol Madan. Anmol earned his PhD at the MIT Media Lab, teaching machines to understand human behavior. He turned that research into Ginger, a behavioral health company he founded and led as CEO, later acquired by Headspace. He then served as chief data scientist at Livongo and Teladoc Health, helping drive one of the largest mergers in digital health history. Today, Anmol is founder and CEO of RadiantGraph and the author of The Machines Will See You Now. Anmol, welcome to the show today. How are you doing?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me, David. I'm excited for this conversation.
All right. How about we dive into this? And off camera, I made a Caltech joke, so no offense to you because, yes, you went to MIT, right?
I did. And so, I can't speak for the Caltech people, so
okay,
they won't get in trouble there.
Yeah, well, we don't want lawsuits against both of us, so we'll carry on to some of the meat of what we want to talk about today. So first of all, I didn't know you run your own podcast as well. Is that right?
So I dabbled in like a podcast. I left my tenure at Livongo and Teladoc. Post acquisition, I spent some time at Teladoc. I was asked to be the chief data scientist of the combined company, and so built a lot of the data AI personalization systems in that role for a few years, and then left. And I was kind of went to a little bit of like, what do I want to do with my life when I grow up situation. And so it's a funny story, David. I told my wife, we're going to travel for 9 months. We're not going to work. That lasted about a week. So I saw some of my high school friends after a while. And then I came back and I'm like, well, I'm starting a podcast and I'm going to go write a book. And then I'm going to maybe start a company if I feel like it, right? Maybe, wasn't sure. Do I go try to like raise a fund and do something else? So I think what I realized about myself is like, when I'm in that creative period, which, every job transition tends to be. And for many, executives, as I'm sure who listen to your podcast, right, they go through this, they spend like you mentioned, they spend a decade at a company like Salesforce, or they spend several years at a very intense job. That moment is just extremely liberating because you can kind of be like, I could do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that period, I kind of dabbled in starting a podcast. I was calling it Autonomous Health. And it was a lot of fun because I was basically inviting all the amazing people I knew who were doing interesting work, researchers, experts, with some great people show up. And I was just chatting with them. And we were just talking about what's happening in their particular research area or their space and how they thought it could work in healthcare. So it was a lot of fun. But then I think the other endeavors kind of caught more steam. So the company started to become real and I couldn't justify the time commitment. But what it taught me is how much work it is to run a successful podcast. And I have a lot more respect for that now. And so kudos to you and others like you who kind of bring this content out there. But it's a fair bit of work.
Yeah, it is. The barrier is so low to creating a podcast now. Anyone with a microphone and a camera can run it, but that also raises the expectations of listeners. You got to have excellent content, regular content, talking about interesting things. And what I find the most interesting is just talking to people that interest me. So like here, like I'm very interested in what you're doing, and we're going to talk more about your book today. The Machines Will See You Now, a human roadmap to autonomous healthcare. That fascinates me because I was a Star Trek fan growing up. TNG, Next Generation, was like still number one. The medical scanner, and they know, oh, you have a tumor, just like that, or like, oh, you don't have a concussion. That stuff still fascinates me. And then intersecting with the AI craze right now, I think it's the right time to talk about this. And
it's right. One of the things I do in the book actually is, and I'm a fellow science fiction nerd as well. in case you couldn't tell this far. And is I weave a lot of threads from popular science fiction, right? And so in one of the early chapters, I kind of talk about, look, we've got this incredible technology, and there's a lot of stuff to figure out, right? How do we make sure it's safe? How do we regulate it? What does it mean for the workforce? Are these systems actually as good as we think they are? Are we even the evals and the benchmarks we're using the right ones? There's a lot of stuff to figure out, right? But if you hold that thought for a second and you think of the science fiction version of this, are we marching towards Mad Max or are we marching towards Star Trek? Right?
Mm-hmm.
What I mean by that is Star Trek is this very benevolent and everybody's got access to the tricorder, and Mad Max or the other dystopian version of science fiction. I talk about Elysium is one of the movies that I think is the thing in this lens, right? Where, there's different tiers of healthcare, and healthcare is highly kind of, the highest quality healthcare is controlled. And in many ways, you look at global healthcare today, you look at the 7 billion people on the planet, there is a pretty stark inequity in the kind of care probably you and I have access to in North America, which is someone in rural Africa has access to, right? Or rural India perhaps. And it's gotten a lot better, but there's still stark delta. And so I think like this is technology and improving things that can, make more accessible care work, is that actually going to amplify that? Are we going to end up in like a dystopian Mad Max kind of universe? Or are we making the right decisions to end up in the kind of benevolent Star Trek, kind of universe where things are?
Yeah.
Things. So that's one of the things that I kind of like. The book's a little bit more of like, it's not just what's happening today, but it's a roadmap for where I think we're going and the decisions that could lead us on either side. That's kind of how I'm structured.
Yeah. Right before this episode, I actually interviewed Stephen Kotler. He also wrote a book with Peter Diamandis, We Are as Gods. And it talked a lot about the abundance of AI, what that does to a population, and how we need to change our mindset in order to thrive in the age of AI abundance. So it's very opportunistic right now that you come on talking about specifically healthcare applications. Now, one of the things that Stephen Kotler and I talked about in our episode was how technology has had an ability to raise the floor, the wealth, if you want to, I can't remember the proper term, but the wealth floor of your average citizen. So we talked about like cell phones, but also the value density. How do you quantify the value in the cell phone? The GPS, the camera, the ability to make calls. And so I guess that's a good launching question for you. And it sort of goes into the middle of your book, and we kind of talked about it. Like, what's your thoughts on that? Like, do you think with all these new technology, does it raise the bar for the accessibility and the ability for your average citizen? Let's just stick to America, okay? Not even Canada or anywhere else. Does it raise the capability for your average person in inner city Chicago, say, to access great healthcare? Or is there something I'm missing here?
So it's a really good question, right?
It's a loaded question.
No, it's a very deep question. There's lots of layers to putting that.
Yeah.
In theory, it should, right? In theory, if you think of, today we're in what I call level 1 healthcare, which is basically like humans make all the decisions, diagnostic treatment decisions. Some parts of healthcare are moving towards what I call in the book level 2 healthcare, which is there's a lot of AI input, clinical decision support for the doctor making a decision. Radiology is a great example where there's been just an onset or, a plethora of kind of algorithms approved by the FDA that help making certain kinds of cancer and radiology decisions easier, right? And then there's, what I call kind of higher levels of automation past that, where we trust machines to make certain kinds of diagnostic and treatment decisions. And we could start with the simplest ones, and we could start with the easiest ones and kind of decide what the rubric is for us to be sure as a society that's safe and that's efficacious, right? And that could obviously improve the quality of life for our healthcare community as well, while reducing the cost of care, while making healthcare more accessible. So in theory, it should. In practice, I think the way our healthcare economy is set up, and I'll talk about the US, I can also talk a little bit about Canada from what I understand of Canada, having done some work with partners over the years. But the way it's set up, I'm not sure that we've figured that, right? So if you look at the most recent literature, and both published literature as well as industry reports, even the last, like I'd say, 3 or 6 months. And while there's a spike in AI adoption, the way we're set up right now is we're actually seeing an increase in healthcare costs, right? There's a number of studies that have come out in the projected kind of estimates in the last, I'd say, even month or two, that talk about with AI, the cost of healthcare is going up, right? And
Why
they
is
would
that?
I know this doesn't
Like,
make any sense. Like, if you've got all this cool automation and we're saying, why is it costing a lot? Because, a lot of where healthcare is getting placed right now is in, how do you do better capture of billing codes? How do you make sure, like, so like it's seeing a lot of adoption in hospital systems in the US, right? In health systems. And so that's actually driving, maybe perhaps more accurate billing, or perhaps, in some cases overbilling. I think you can decide where you are at that point. And so you're seeing this kind of being used in that direction, and that's where the short-term impact is, right? So I think if we're serious about the person in inner cities of, whether it's Chicago or it's West Oakland, whatever you choose, right, getting access to much better healthcare, I think we have some work to do at the society level, right? Which is, how do we think of embracing these technologies? How do you create pathways for these technologies to be successful? How do we create kind of opportunities for these technologies to take on more of the burden? Then I know CMS, which is the Center for Medicaid, Medicare, is thinking about this. The FDA is thinking about this. So there are people in government in different stages thinking about this, but we're still early. And if we don't design so I think first step is acceptance. It's like, hey, this stuff is here. Do we want to create pathways for these technologies to play a bigger role? And what decisions are going to get us to lower cost of care and better access to care? And then two is then saying, okay, great. What does that mean? How do we tweak what kind of safeguards or pilot projects or sandboxes do we want to create to encourage that kind of innovation here, right? So I think that one of the conversations I'm hoping to spark with this book, which is, let's not be scared of the change that's coming. Think of these AI systems as like toddlers learning to walk, right? So they are going to make mistakes. There are things that they're not good at, but can we create a safe playpen for them to operate? Because if they do work, they can help us scale access to care for, many, many different scenarios in the next couple
yeah,
of decades.
yeah, and what you're saying there, like how the cost, the healthcare costs have gone up. It just sounds like a lot of manual work. Cell one in this spreadsheet is not matching this cell. They're automating a lot of those processes now, and all the back end stuff. But the question is,
Even just on that part, right? If you're automating back-end processes, so if you get look at the healthcare workforce, and the U.S. estimate is about, I think, 22 million. I'm just going off memory. It's in that range, right? It may be off a minute or two. The number of U.S. healthcare professionals providing actual care, right? So doctors, nurses, therapists, is about 5 billion, 4.5, 5 billion, right? So the bulk of the workforce is kind of the administrative, the techs, the other roles in healthcare. And so if we truly are, and so there's a question of what happens to those roles and how do we elevate those roles, which is a longer conversation that we need to have. But putting that aside for a second, if we truly are actually automating the administrative workloads, the cost of healthcare should be going down. Why is it's at least this year it's projected to
yeah,
go up, right? 2027
yeah,
is going to be higher than 2026. And the number one issue that people are citing is the increased use of AI.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's
That
the
tells us
interesting
there's
thing too.
something broken in the mechanism. And this
Yeah,
is a very US centric answer. I think in Canada, just to kind of flip this, obviously, to my knowledge, and you guys are the experts there, but it's obviously a lot of the provincial governments, right? So Ontario has its kind of, healthcare system, and British Columbia has its own. And so there, the question is going to be, how do these technologies enter that work stream, right? So how does this fits in the provincial kind of healthcare, where machines can take on, the administrative tasks? Maybe they can take on the kind of, easiest of care management, case management stuff that's not happening today, perhaps for people in rural counties or other places, right? So I think those are all, again, like, how do you adopt these technologies and what's the right mechanism? I think that all has to be. And then there's a longer conversation for Canada, which is like, is this like a sovereign investment? Is this working with US based partners? Which I think is we could probably talk for hours for a lot of these things.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, and you've lost me on the word sovereign. No, I'm just joking. But here's where my selfish interest is. We started talking about how I am a sci-fi geek just like you. I'm most interested in how you apply these new technology, emerging technologies, to more of the diagnostic side of things. How you can actually support, doctors, nurses, and all the clinical people provide better care, more accurate diagnoses, more faster, help just basically helping these clinicians, right? When people are sick, helping them do their job better. Like, do you talk what do you talk about there in the book?
Yeah, and so I think what we're seeing very broadly with the current adoption curve of AI is, there's always been investments in clinical decision support tools and other things that the leading health organizations use have made. But I think that gets accelerated with the current technology curve, right? So the idea that for a variety of clinical needs, the systems are kind of understanding the needs of the patient. They're helping identify. I mean, this takes so many forms, David. So there's interpreting lab data better. And this, especially with the latest multimodal models, they're incredible at kind of ingesting lab data, combining that, right? So it's kind of changed how we think of machine vision and sort of segmentation type models that we were using even 5 or 7 years ago. Similarly for, medication interactions. I mean, there's just so much interesting stuff there. So I think that's on one side. I think the part that LLMs are exponentially better than any previous class of model is when you benchmark their ability to ingest clinical data and also then start to help with like assistant treatment, diagnostic decisions, treatment decisions, right? So feeding this input, I'll use kind of psychiatry as an example, right? So when we were, working on Ginger, and this is about a decade ago, we had a clinical kind of psychiatrist at the time work with our AI team and build out a model for which person should get what SSRIs, right? So it turns out there's 40 something SSRIs that she could prescribe and a panel of psychiatrists could prescribe. And then, they are a function of, the demographics, the life situation. Is the person pregnant? Are they, what's their acuity? What kind of chronic condition do they have in addition to their mental health needs? And you can kind of decide like a, really simple algorithm that sort of says solve this decision tree and figure this out. And even that algorithm was 90 something percent, match rate with a panel of human psychiatrists. And this is about 10 years ago, right? And so the ability of models to make those kinds of, to have those kinds of outputs and solve those kinds of equations across different diseases is spectacular, right? And so there's study after study that shows that. There's a bit of an asterisk on that right now, which is I think a lot of the way these models are being evaluated is based on data sets that were kind of collected for human training. So often people use MedQA or some of the other data sets. And so there's an asterisk. Is that the right methodology? Do these models fail a certain way? How do we think of those? We'll solve that problem as we go along. And I think it'll probably get solved in the next couple of years, is my view. So I think that part is really interesting. How that plugs into the healthcare experience, and is it just another clinical decision support tool, or do we want consumers of healthcare to go online and start doing like inputs and getting feedback on their symptoms? Is that something that is going to be in a future version of chat gpt or anthropic's tool? Is that something that's going to be built and deployed by health? I think all that stuff is not figured out yet. And so when you think of like where this, to your point of like, you've got basic clinical decision support stuff, it's getting a lot better. We've got the mathematical underpinnings of machines making differential diagnosis decisions or treatment recommendations. It's getting better. It's better in some disease areas than others. There's study after study that kind of benchmarks accuracy. There's a lot of mathematical takes that we still have to apply to them. I think we're still kind of scratching the surface of how much potential there is. How we use that, how we apply that, where that fits in, not clear. And that's the part where we kind of have to, what I'm hoping with the book is we sort of reframe this discussion as sort of less of fear of like, oh my God, this stuff is happening and it's not 100% right. But we sort of think of it as, great, you've got this thing. It sort of works for some things most of the time. Is there a safe place for it to play and get better and then escalate to a high level of human care once it's kind of like knows it's out of its depth, right? And have the right safeguards for that escalation to happen successfully. So I think those are the things that I think we have to figure out when you think of clinical care at scale.
Yeah. What are we doing well right now in terms of integrating AI and into healthcare right now? What do we do well?
Yeah. What do we do well in terms of? I think what is absolutely true right now is there's an awareness inside every healthcare organization about the shift that's coming. And so, there's a study I think just recently that someone shared with me, which is there's an estimated, 62% of it's, some McKinsey data and a couple of other data sources, Carter data, 62% of all healthcare organizations that were polled, and these are leading kind of national healthcare organizations, right? So it's not the mom and pop clinics, are saying that they're actively investing in AI. It's on their radar. I think every CEO of a large healthcare organization is aware. So I think there's an incredible awareness in the market about the transformative nature and benefits of these technologies today. And so I think that's definitely a plus. It's about, depending on which stat you believe, where one of the studies kind of talks about a $45 billion allocation of capital that's going to happen in healthcare AI adoption just in the next year or so, right? So very rapid curves. So I think we're doing that well. I think there is an awareness that this is different from maybe 10 years ago or 5 years ago. We've been talking about machine learning and AI for a long time. So this time it feels different. And I think people have recognized that. So I think that's definitely, awareness is a big thing. The other piece that has moved really fast is, I think in the last year, there's been a remarkable adoption of a number of operational AI kind of use cases in healthcare, right? And so this is where there's a number of leading companies that offer the ability to kind of scribe and then do note taking using AI systems for what's happening in doctors' visits, right? So I think a lot of the day-to-day, like if you're in a visit, how do you transcribe that? How do you kind of understand the clinical context, create notes, summarize that? That ability has become pretty widespread, and I think by all estimates is seeing a lot of that adoption in the industry. Now, I still think that's kind of like, it's not getting the core of, increasingly autonomous healthcare, but it's an operational element that can potentially have high leverage. And again, there's there's different viewpoints of that, but I think the general viewpoint is it takes away a lot of the human burden for doctors, and the aim is it frees up kind of more time that they can spend in that visit working with the patient that's visiting them. And so I think that's kind of an adoption curve we've seen fast. There's a pretty high adoption curve, I'd say, in the last year and even in the first half of this year for a lot of voice AI agents for a variety of, I'll call them like member operational use cases. And we're starting to see that happen now for more coaching and care management use cases, including at my day job at RadiantGraph. We built these AI systems that are out there and saying, hey, let me help figure out, connect David so that he can get his PCP visit done. He hasn't seen a doctor for a year, or here's a, missing health information for you, or here's a pharmacy reminder, or maybe there's an adherence, value that you're struggling with. So those use cases are seeing tremendous uptick in volume. And, we're doing, tens of thousands of kind of conversations on behalf of our customers of that. So I think that's sort of like where those cases are moving really fast, much faster than I think anyone would have expected a year ago.
Yeah. You talk a lot about change management.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm sure like in your day job as a CEO of RadiantGraph, it's like getting people to change, getting organizations to change is really hard. But what are some of the ways we can, like, AI is this thing that's, whether you like it or not, it's here. So adapt or die, right? But how do you, I'd like to ask leaders this, how do you get organizations and the people in these organizations to change? Like a lot of this technology, I really feel it's like, hey, you got to use it. It's here. It's not just coming, it's here. How do you get people to change?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I'll kind of wear my builder of companies kind of executive hat for a second as I answer that, and less of the computer scientist researcher hat, right? But I think startups are actually way easier for change management. That's what I love about startups. It's like the only thing you actually have in your favor is speed, right? Because you don't have a lot of people, you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of time. The only thing you have is like smart people who can move really fast. And either you're right or you're wrong, but you find out. Right. So I think that's kind of what I love. So startups, I think, have less of an issue. And frankly, I think 90% of people should not work at a startup because you kind of have to be very comfortable with it's kind of like the flexibility of, jumping and moving, making fast decisions. Most of the time it's incomplete data. So I think that's kind of like the people who gravitate towards that usually have a much easier time. And one of the things I talk about in the book is like at some point you kind of hit the scaling curve, and the first product manager you had who could solve 16 things may not be the right person to lead product at scale. And you've got to ask yourself, like, do I have kind of talk about it, the trade-off between kind of exploration and exploitation, right? Or how you kind of think of that curve. And so like at some point you're going to have to redesign your org or think about where people play. So I think startups are actually easier for change management. The change management lessons I've learned kind of working in larger companies, and I'm sure even with your experience at places like Salesforce, we've got like you working with clients who are 100,000 people, right? Like that's the hard stuff where you're helping them kind of adopt something new. That's way harder. And what I've realized there, certainly there's a lot of like use the toys, use the kind of tools, try it in Claude, try it in like a favorite system. And that's all great. I think the biggest thing that's worked for me in that change management is actually flipping it and tying it back to business outcomes. And so in those roles, serving as the chief data scientist or the chief AI officer of public companies, I had to develop really deep relationships with our CFO or with our chief marketing officer or our chief medical officer. And so kind of pick the business problem that we were solving. Right. And so if the business problem is, hey, and one of the things that I talk about in the book is when you think of this new kind of healthcare, like it changes how we think of operational scaling, right? So if you've got tens of thousands of providers, you've got to match them to the right patient coming in, it's all virtual care. It sort of looks a lot like operational scaling inside how, Uber works than it does inside a traditional doctor's office does, right? Or any other kind of like consumer health, consumer business, right? And so, part of the way, I found change management work in those roles is to kind of define those success parameters up and early with the right business stakeholders, right? And so like me and you as our CFO or as our medical leader agreeing on like, here's what we're going to optimize for. And then that gives the AI teams and the engineering teams a lot of freedom because you know what the end objective metric is, right? The places where I think it goes south and where I've seen it go south in companies is where, and, I see a lot of this actually at risk right now, where like you're signing up for all this, we're going to commit to AI, we're going to have all this token spend and you're doing all this work. But halfway through the year, you're stuck with a bunch of prototypes and the CFO is knocking on your door and is like, where's the ROI, buddy? Right? Where is this thing? And so that's the thing that I think companies do. So it's kind of like counter, which is I find it's less about educating people on the tech, people who believe in the tech. I think if I can get them to agree on like, assume this is a magic wand, it can do anything. Is this the right bar? If is 10% better than what you were doing with the legacy tools or 50% better, is that the bar where you believe in the magic and you believe this is real? Like, let's agree on that and we will obsessively hit that.
So you're a founder of multiple companies. What's some of the hardest experience, like really tough experience you've had in building or running your own company?
Yeah, I think, startups are always hard. And I think, there's numerous experiences building Ginger. I mean, even at RadiantGraph, there are days where you kind of come out and be like, oh, wow, we just went through that. That's great. So I think, when I think of the trickiest, if our product doesn't work, if our tech doesn't work, if we miss some kind of thing that we had committed to, I think I can live with those. The things that are hardest, I think, for me to process are things where we feel like we're building the right thing, we have the right technology, and society or like the ecosystem is just not there and sort of seeing that vision yet. And so I'll give you an example in mental health. Like we built one of the early kind of comprehensive full stack mental health solutions. We started as a technology selling into leading healthcare, health systems, and realized that if you were doing preventative mental health stuff, and avoiding people going to their psychiatrist, to reducing the kind of the visits, like it actually was a little bit counter to the fee-for-service economic incentive that they have, right? So it kind of rebuild the entire company and, go work directly with employers and with health plans, right? But that process, I think for people on the outside can be really confusing, which is like, hey, I don't understand why we're doing this. It's, if you're not in healthcare, if you're not in the trenches. And then 3 or 4 years later, I think that became not just us, but the industry norm, right? So all the leading players, Lyra, Spring, Modern, kind of had a similar model. And I think, some of us got there around the same time. And so I think this is where it's one of those, where those situations I find are the hardest because, this might be my personal quirk or how my brain works. I can kind of see it around the corner. I'm like, this is where we're going. But I think society is not there yet, right? Or people aren't there yet. So I find those things to be really hard. I think the thing that happens as you scale companies, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners have that experience too, is like, earlier on in one's career, right, when it's your first startup and everything else, you tend to take this stuff a lot more personally, right? And so you kind of tend to hey, my God, what can I? And so I think with you is like as a scale in a role. And I think a lot of leaders do this, and as we build years of experience, is you kind of learn how to distance yourself from like, hey, we're doing these things, but sometimes our hypotheses are just not right, or sometimes our hypotheses are just not accurate. And look, RadiantGraph is a couple of years old, and we have some great customers and some great proof points, but it's still early, right? There's a chance that it couldn't work out, right? And just because they've had prior successes, there's no guarantee that this one's going to be. I mean, I'm hoping it will be, but there's no guarantee, right? Statistically.
Yeah.
So I think like that's where you kind of get more comfortable with that as you scale, as you maybe have a few years of experience, and you're like, great, we're just going to like keep doing what we're doing, keep our head down, and not get distracted by all the things that
Yeah.
could go sideways or that people don't get yet.
Well, I guess what keeps you going? Because I mean, you wrote this book. The machines will see you now. What if we were to talk in another, year or two? What impact do you hope to have on people with this book?
Yeah, so I think you asked me a couple of. So I think the first question, what keeps me going, is fundamentally I just want the stuff to exist in the world. Right. And so I don't care a lot about most things. Right. And I'm not the, and a lot of my friends, I'm not the person who's kind of, my coworkers still make fun of my men's fashion choices sometimes. Right. Or whatever. Like, I meet the bar, but I'm not obsessive. But there's some things I'm just like,
it's fine. It's fine.
It's fine. For those of you on audio, I'm very well dressed today, right? But I think like there are things that I do care deeply about, right? And so this is one of those problems where I can kind of see it solved in my head, and I just want to kind of have it exist in the world. So I think that's the thing that fundamentally drives me, which is, and it's sort of. It takes a lot of effort and a lot of patience, but it's also very rewarding, right? There's nothing as satisfying as kind of having a vision and I'm sure you feel that way as you're doing your work, is like you have a vision for something and you're kind of like, we're just going to go, like, it's the most thrilling thing in the world in many ways, right? So I think that part, so that's what drives me. When I think of the impact on the book, I think in the next year, the biggest thing for me is connecting what I think are 3 different conversations that are currently broken. Right. So on one side, you've got a whole bunch of AI experts, people like myself living in San Francisco saying things like, hey, AI is 99% better than most doctors or whatever. Right. And so there's a lot of that. And in some ways, they're kind of right when you look at the model performance with the perfect inputs and the perfect lab setting. So I think that's one dialogue. The other side is there's a lot of anxiety and I'd say, fear about these technologies, and rightly so. They're not, validated for the most part. There's a lot of stuff people are, throwing on the wall. And I'm talking about clinical decision making in particular, right? Where like, what does the guardrails look like? How do we test these things? How do we ensure they're safe? Like that stuff is not figured out yet. And I think we as a society, with help from our medical leaders and our medical community, will have to decide that. And then the third bucket is like the consumer appetite, where consumers are going to ChatGPT or they are going to TikTok, and they're getting there's a recent somebody shared with me, there's a lot of now like fake AI doctors on social media, right? They are like actual doctors, but like AI generated avatars, and like so that is going to happen because there's consumer demand, right? Because the first thing you and I do when we have a symptom is we go try to Google it and look for information online. So I think those 3 forces are converging. And the biggest thing I hope to accomplish with the book is to tie that in one conversation in one roadmap, right? So encapsulates the advances in AI, helps us as a society kind of figure out like, here are the guardrails, here's how we test it. This is what's okay, this we're not ready for until we hit these milestones, and gives consumers access to better care, more cost-effective care, and kind of accelerates the adoption of these technologies, not kind of shuts it down or kind of has, I'd like to live in a world where healthcare costs half as much and is higher quality, and the people in, inner city Chicago or West Oakland or certain parts of the world have access to like, high quality healthcare. For that to happen, those 3 things have to kind of get solved. We have to get past the way.
If people need to see what you're up to and what's going on in your life and what you're doing next, like how do they find you and what are you doing next? Are you writing another book? What are you up to, my friend?
No, I just did this book, and books are a lot of work. So I have a day job, which is I'm the founder and CEO of a really fun company in San Francisco called RadiantGraph, which is an AI platform for large healthcare health plans, providers, solving for some of the use cases, not all the stuff I talk about in the book, but some of the stuff we're doing. And yeah, so I would love, please, you can reach me at RadiantGraph. You can find me there. You can find me on and then other social media as well. But yeah, I think for anybody who's interested in this dialogue or is excited to kind of shape this stuff, I'm always welcome to kind of brainstorm or do interesting things together. It's an opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
yeah,
the one thing that being a computer scientist hammers into you is, unlike many other professions, is like the rate of change is so high that you have
yeah.
just an incredible amount of, humility. Anything you know today is going to be obsolete in like years. I
Well,
feel like most of my career, it's just been, it's
yeah.
accelerated in AI, but I think for most of my career, like everything that you learn just becomes obsolete in like 2 years. So
Well,
the only skill you really have is learning.
well, the futurist Ray Kurzweil, I think that's how you say his last name. He's made many AI predictions and many technology predictions. He's been right in most of them. His prediction is that in the next 10 years, and he said this last year, in the next 10 years, we're going to make 100 years worth of technological progress. And so, every year is like 10 years
Yeah,
over the
it's an
next 10 years.
exciting time to be alive, David.
And I'm glad I'm here to see it and talk to experts like you about this. So, but Anmol, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast, and thanks everyone for listening in. If you listen right to the end here, smash that love button or like button and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. All right, ciao. That's a wrap on this episode of the Coachful Coaching Leadership Podcast. I'm David Fung, and my mission is to help leaders grow, lead with impact, and build thriving teams. If you found this valuable, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a fellow leader. Until next time, keep leading with purpose.